Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Diablo 3 patch 2.6.1 season 12 guide on upcoming content, yes, for the Delsere's Magnum Opus build for the Wizard. Delsere's? The DMO Wizard. Currently on the test server, this build has been super buffed and is now one of the top builds. We've seen it clear as high as a Greater Rift 110. And as we're showing you the footage of the gameplay, we're just going to take a quick 10 seconds to let you know that if you would like to get your name on the Rikers Raiders 2017 t-shirt, you have until the end of September. All it takes is $1 to get your name on the shirt. Check out the link in the description below. Diving into the build now, let's take a look at a gear overview. This all revolves around the DMO set. The 2-piece bonus reduces a cooldown on slow time by 3 seconds every time you cast an assortment of skills. The 4-piece bonus makes you take 60% less damage while you have slow time active, which should be at all times. And the 6-piece bonus makes enemies affected by slow time and for a few seconds thereafter take a bunch more damage from an assortment of skills. This build will revolve around Arcane Orb, specifically Frozen Orb, a nice callback to Diablo 2's Sorceress. Now, DMO wizards have been around for a while, but they simply weren't competitive with the best wizard builds. Now they are. So apart from the full DMO set, you'll need an unstable scepter. This makes Arcane Orb deal a bunch more damage. As an offhand, either equipped or in your cube, you'll also need the Triumvirate. Your signature spells increase the damage of Arcane Orb by a ton, and it stacks. So you're going to want to maintain the full 3 stacks on this to maintain your maximum damage potential. The signature spell we're going to be casting is Spectral Blade, so you want to cast that at least once every 6 seconds in order to maintain that triple buff stack. Now, all the rest of the items in this build are negotiable. There are even some variants that you can go with. We're taking a Traveler's Pledge and Compass Rose combination in order to buff our damage and our toughness. You don't have to go with this combination, but it is highly recommended. For our belt, the Shame of Delsere is a big buff to this build. It just really helps with resource management as well as keeping up your stacks. Remember that we want to maintain that Triumvirate triple buff stack, so being able to attack 50% faster lets you get those 3 stacks that much quicker. Now, you almost always see the Orb of Infinite Depth in one of these builds. This gives you a nice damage reduction buff as well as a damage buff. This build will revolve around stacking various buffs quite a bit. So you do want to maintain the maximum 4 stack on this item. With this item, every time you hit an enemy with Explosive Blast, your damage is increased by up to 10%. So that goes up to 40% at the max 4 stack, and your damage reduction is increased by 20%. This is a very powerful source of damage reduction, and it's also a nice damage buff. Whether you cube the Triumvirate or the Orb of Infinite Depth will largely depend on which rolls better for you, but in general it is more difficult to get a perfectly rolled Triumvirate, so you're probably going to be equipping your Orb of Infinite Depth. A Convention of Elements is a really strong choice for a ring. You're going to want to maximize your damage window while you're on cold damage. This build is powerful, but it is not the easiest to play. There's a lot of things to manage, a lot of things to time. It's really about getting the right rotation down. If you're just looking for a mindless, fun build, this probably isn't the best solution. That said, it could be mindless enough at lower Greater Rift difficulties or just rift farming. Now, the next jewelry item here is up for debate. The classical choice was the Halo of Arleze. With the Halo of Arleze, you would also be equipping Ice Armor, Crystallize, and the Halo of Arleze gives you more damage reduction versus melee attacks and unleashes a Frost Nova whenever you basically get hit while Greater Rift pushing. However, a new option now is the Halo of Karini. With this, you would instead take Storm Armor, and you take less damage for 4 seconds every time your Storm Armor electrocutes an enemy that is more than 15 yards away, and 15 yards isn't too great of a distance. We'll explore the choice between these 2 rings a little bit more as we get to skills. For your bracers, you have a choice of 3. You can go with either Ranslar's Folly, you can go with Strong Arm Bracers, or you can go with Ancient Parthan Defenders. And you're always welcome to use one of these in your cube if you're going for another to equip. The main purpose of Ranslar's Folly is to be able to group enemies. Yes, it does buff the damage of Energy Twister, but that's not really significant. What is being able to pull enemies together to line them up for your Frozen Orb. Ancient Parthan Defenders give you more damage reduction for stunned enemies. This particularly works if you're going with the Halo of Arlese, because enemies will be stunned next to you when they get frozen with the Frozen Nova. And as for strong arm bracers, that's more damage. Now, another option for the armor slot in your cube are the illusory boots. These allow you to walk through enemies unhindered. Now, we're not actually going for teleport in this build, so having the illusory boots is really strong. You're actually able to get yourself out of any situation, walk through monsters that can often be a lifesaver. For our gems, we'll want to go with a Bane of the Trap. That's going to be more damage at all times. We're going to want a Zay's Stone of Vengeance. We want to keep enemies at basically as far away as they can be, which I believe is going to be 45 yards. We'll get to that in a moment. It's going to be the very end of the range of Frozen Orb. And then for your last gem, for Greater Rift pushing, you eventually start migrating towards a Bane of the Stricken, but that's only if it's taking a very long time to kill the Rift Guardian. Otherwise, the Bane of the Powerful will serve you better throughout the Rift. If your damage bonus on Bane of the Powerful is not dropping off, then it's still being useful to you. Now, before we take a closer look at what you want on your gear, we're going to look at the skills. Now, for your signature spell, you got choices to make here. You see me running with Spectral Blade, Barrier Blades. This is a melee option, but it's a melee option that builds up an absorb shield for you. We're not using our signature spell to deal any damage. It's literally just going to be for maintaining resource and maintaining stacks. The stacks that we spoke of before and that we'll continue to talk about. You could instead go with Magic Missile, Glacial Spike. This would slow enemies coming at you, and you can also go with Conflagrate. And the sole purpose there is to get some fire damage to chain with a passive that we'll talk about in a bit. Prior to this patch, DMO wizards were very close range melee. Rather than Frozen Orb, they were going with Arcane Orbit, so you had to be next to enemies, so the only real choice was Spectral Blades. Now that we're distancing ourselves, Magic Missile has become a very good option. Something non-negotiable, however, is Explosive Blast, Chain Reaction. We need Explosive Blast in order to synergize with our items, in order to bring up our buffs for damage and toughness. Each explosion from Chain Reaction will count towards getting your buff stacks up. This is why we have to take Chain Reaction. This makes it easier to maintain your buff stacks. Next, you'll want to go with Slow Time, and you can pick between one of two runes here. As a base effect, Slow Time makes a bubble that slows enemies. Exhaustion makes those enemies deal less damage, but you can also choose Stretch Time, where if you're standing in the bubble, you'll attack 10% faster. So it's really your decision on whether you want to deal more damage or take less damage. Our main damage dealer here will be Arcane Orb, Frozen Orb. This one's non-negotiable. With patch 2.6.1, Frozen Orb goes further and deals more damage. It's just the best rune for Arcane Orb. Now, if you're taking the Ranslar's Folly Bracers, you want to take Energy Twister. Mistral Breeze is the rune to go with. It makes it cost less resource. Again, Energy Twister is not a damage source here, it's just to group monsters. If you're not going for Ranslar's Folly, then instead of Energy Twister, you'll want to take Black Hole. This, again, is not for its damage, but for its grouping ability. The rune you take is negotiable. You could go with Supermassive. This creates a larger area to suck enemies in. You can go with Absolute Zero to further buff your Frozen Orb. Or you can go with Spell Steal to give yourself a damage buff / toughness buff. If I had to rank those in order of preference, I'd probably go Supermassive, Spell Steal, Absolute Zero. Then lastly, for your armor, again, it's either Ice Armor or Storm Armor. At its base, Ice Armor is protecting you from melee attacks. The Crystallize rune makes it such that if you are struck by a melee attack, your armor is buffed for 30 seconds, and this could stack up to 3 times. Now, this was definitely the go-to choice in the previous patch. But now the buff to the Halo of Karini, combined with this build being less in your face, makes this more debatable. So Storm Armor is now an option. Storm Armor at its base does not confer any toughness, any damage mitigation. It just deals an insignificant amount of damage to enemies. Power of the Storm is a pretty nice rune that really helps with resource management, and that's the rune you would like to go with if you pick Storm Armor. The damage mitigation comes entirely from your Halo of Karini, that ring that gives you damage reduction when your Storm Armor strikes an enemy that is a certain distance away from you. Feel free to experiment with either option. Depending on which ring drops for you first, that would decide which shield you go with. Alright, on to our passives. Unstable Anomaly gives you that free life. It's a pretty safe choice to take. Power Hungry is another must-have. You deal more damage to enemies that are 30 yards or more away from you. That's another reason why we don't want to be too close while we're shooting our arcane orbs. We really want to take advantage of the range of the skill and keep enemies at least 30 yards away. Our other passives are somewhat up for debate. You can go with Blur, that just gives you less damage. You can go with Conflagration. This will increase your damage once you hit enemies with fire damage. That's one reason you might want to go with Conflagration on your magic missile. Conflagrate. But even if you don't go with that, then simply relying on your Explosive Blast chain reaction could trigger your Conflagration, but at range, it's a little bit more difficult. Part of Explosive Blast is actually moving into enemies close enough to maintain your stacks, then backing away in order to shoot off your Frozen Orb, all while maintaining your rotation on your convention of elements, so you want to time it such that you've backed away from enemies in time to hurl your Frozen Orbs during your cold rotation. Astral Presence is another really good passive to consider here. More regeneration means more Frozen Orbs. You can also go with Elemental Exposure. This is another reason to have Conflagrate on Magic Missile. If you do go with Elemental Exposure, you'll want to make sure that you have 4 different elemental types in order to maintain this elemental exposure buff. Storm Armor would cover lightning. Frozen Orb obviously covers cold. Explosive Blast, you could rely on that to cover your fire. And then either Spectral Blades or Black Hole to cover your arcane. And another option here is even Cold-Blooded. It'll make you deal more damage to enemies you've frozen or chilled. So that covers the skills. Let's take a closer look now at the gear. I do not have optimized gear as I mouse over. Don't look at what I have, listen to the stats that I'm going to read off. For your shoulders, you want Intelligence, Vitality, Area Damage, then either Life % or Armor. For your helm, Intelligence, Vitality, Crit Chance, and then you're actually going to put a Topaz in the helm for that resource cost reduction. This is not a cooldown dependent build, so putting a diamond in there doesn't help you all that much. You could instead go with an Amethyst for more life if you want, but a Topaz will help you squeeze out a bit more damage. On your amulet, you want cold damage, crit chance. On your chest, Intelligence, Vitality, Armor, or Life %. On your gloves, Intelligence, crit, area damage. Your bracers, cold damage, Intelligence, Vitality, crit. Your belt, all defensive stats, Intelligence, Vitality, Life, and Armor. For your pants, Intelligence, Vitality, Armor. And anywhere that you don't have all resist, try to get a secondary resistance. For your boots, Intelligence, Vitality, Armor, Arcane Orb damage. And if you want to be really reckless, you can even get Arcane Orb damage instead of Vitality on your helm. For your Unstable Scepter, you want damage %, Intelligence, and attack speed. Of course, along with an emerald inside of it. For your offhand, Intelligence, crit chance, area damage, Arcane Orb damage. For your Compass Rose, ideally Intelligence, crit, area damage. And for your Convention of Elements, crit, area damage. For your Paragon points, get your total move speed up to 25%, then dump everything into Intelligence. For offense, crit chance, crit damage, attack speed, cooldown. For defense, armor, life %, all resist, life regen. And for utility, area damage, resource cost reduction, life per hit. And that wraps up this guide. Note that this was recorded on the test server. Everything is still subject to change, although I don't expect anything major to change. I will have a link in the description below to a D3 planner version of this build, so if anything minor changes, go check out that link for the most up-to-date gear and skills and everything you'll want to take. And if there's a big enough change to this build, I'll try to release an updated video closer to the launch of the new season. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. If you enjoyed this video, please share it, check out these other videos, and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders for more Diablo content.